Welcome to iPad Pros, the show all about using your iPad to be productive and get work done. I'm Tim Chen, host of the show.
Hello there, and welcome back to another episode of iPad Pros. Joining today on the podcast once again is Matt Gemmell. Matt has been on the podcast twice before, once on episode 40 and another time on episode 139. Matt is a novelist and does a lot of other things on the iPad, or did, as we'll talk about. He's making the switch back to the Mac after 8 years of being on the iPad. So in this episode, we're going to dive into his journey of what that iPad experience was like and what finally made him make that switch. So I hope you enjoy this discussion about the iPad and the Mac and kind of the pros and cons of the different platforms and when it is the right time to use the iPad versus the Mac. If you'd like to support this podcast, you can do so at patreon.com/iPadPros or by subscribing in Apple Podcasts. My great thanks to everyone that supports the show. It is greatly, greatly appreciated. And by supporting the show financially, you'll get early access to both iPad Pros and Vision Pros. With that, here's my discussion with Matt. Enjoy. Welcome back to the podcast, Matt.
Thank you so much, Tim. Always a pleasure to speak to you.
It's been a bit, yeah. So you've been on the show twice. Once back in the early days, December of 2018. How many years ago is that? That's like 7 years ago. Yeah, back for episode 40. Wow.
I confess I had forgotten about that first appearance. I remember what I thought was my first, but was in fact my second.
Yeah, then the second one was we're at 100 episodes later for episode 139, April of 2022, so about 3 years ago. And so in those episodes, we went pretty deep on kind of your novel writing setup with the iPad. And now, some 3 years later, a bit of a shakeup we'll be talking about. Moving away from the iPad as your primary computer after 8 years using it.
A big change.
So in this episode, we're going to kind of dive into a bit of that and kind of that switch away from it. And so you started with the iPad Pro as like your main computer. Was that right? The 9.7 inch?
Yeah, that's right. When I made the change in October of, was it 2016? You've probably read the article more recently than I wrote it. So yeah, it was a 9.7 inch iPad Pro. And then I think the next one was the 10.5 that they briefly made, which is now my 4-year-old's YouTube watching machine.
Oh, that's my 2-year-old daughter's iPad now. That's funny. I still
moved up to the 12.9s.
Oh, that's great. Yeah. As you just mentioned with my daughter, the smart connector, we don't have lightning things around that much. So it's like we have the little dock that Belkin made, and I just pop it on there to keep it topped off. And she'll like point up to above on the wardrobe. It's like, no, we're not doing like it because it's like an crack glass case of emergency kind of iPad, it's yeah. So anyways,
completely understand. What age is your daughter?
2.5.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, so it's
we've got a slightly more actively communicative and bargaining or coercing sort of relationship with the 4-year-old.
Yeah.
But yeah, the iPad it heals all wounds in certain circumstances.
It can, yeah. So yeah, the 10.5. I love that guy. I don't know how long that thing will keep running, but I'm happy to keep using it. So then you moved up to the bigger ones, the 12.9s and the 13.
Yeah, it was just a series of those. I think I had, was there an M1? And then maybe another one, and then of course the M4 most recently, which is 13 inch instead of a 12.9 inch. That was the first time it was an actual 13 inch. And I got that whenever it came out. So it's only been whatever that length of time has been. And to be honest, certainly with the way I was using the iPads before, I didn't really notice any difference.
Does it feel like a 13 versus 12.9? Like, do you notice that point, whatever?
No, I just mean in terms of how responsive the system was and the apps and so on. It didn't really feel like it had improved. Not that it ever felt that it needed to in terms of, sort of heavy processing performance. That is not the issue that I ran into with the iPad, which I obviously talked about a wee bit in the article.
Yeah, it's interesting because with the M4, you started using it more as a laptop and never taking it out of the keyboard case, which is just super interesting because it's like super thin and like the one you'd want to be holding more. Like, do you understand why you ended up doing that?
Yeah, I mean, it's partly because of the nature of my work. You know, I'm writing novels. That's what I do. And you really do need a keyboard for that. You certainly can get by on the touchscreen, but it's not very pleasant or comfortable.
Because you would still use an external keyboard at the desk, right? So it would just be on there as a stand kind of thing?
Split mechanical keyboards at the desk. I'm one of those people with a cupboard full of mechanical keyboards in various states of disassembly or assembly. And it's just all plugged in through a Thunderbolt 4 at the moment. Hub, a Magic Trackpad, Bluetooth, external monitor since recently, which was part of, I think, the catalyst for this big change back to the Mac. But yeah, I would, in the evenings, or if I was going somewhere to a coffee shop or somewhere else, I would always be obviously taking the Magic Keyboard anyway. And I found that for maybe the most recent year of my full-time iPad usage, it just never came out of the Magic Keyboard, with the sole very, very brief exception that I do autographed ebooks of my novels, and of course that naturally requires using the pencil on the screen to do the autograph on the cover of the ebook file. But that would be a matter of minutes. Other than that, the pencil stayed attached and the iPad stayed in the keyboard case all the time.
Is the autographed ebook something that you'll keep the iPad around as one of the tasks that it gets to do?
That will be one of its, I suspect, only continuing work-related tasks. Obviously, as a tablet on its own, it's wonderful for entertainment side of things and photos and idly catching up on little bits and pieces while you're doing something else, recipes, blah, blah, blah. And it is supremely well suited to those things at all times, and very capable for work as well. I used it for more than 8 years. But I think for me, that'll be one of its few continuing work-related roles.
I see. So outside of novel writing and stories and whatnot, how has your computer usage expanded over the years? Like in your article, you share that for novel writing, the iPad's still an awesome thing, to the focus of it and simplicity, but your usage of computers has grown and needs.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't even necessarily characterize it as growth. It is that, but I wouldn't express it that way, because that creates a certain sense of preference, or something has to win and something has to lose, and it's absolutely not how I feel, because I dearly love the iPad, and I am keeping the iPad Pro that I have, and I love the platform. It's not abandoning so much as a switching, but the things that I needed to do became maybe more and more oriented with desktop computers. Examples being I have music production as a hobby. There are many wonderful DAWs, digital audio workstations, on the iPad. A cut-down version of Cubase, Cubasis. There are, I mean, of course, they've got Logic Pro for iPad and a whole number of other ones. But the issue can be with peripheral support, supporting all of the various knobs and sliders and buttons and so on, motorized faders on the kind of equipment you plug in to help you edit audio and produce music. I have a MIDI controller, a keyboard in the sort of piano sense, that slides out from under my desk, and it's essentially just a glorified electric piano, and it's plugged into the iPad, whereas on the Mac, of course, all of the knobs and sliders and buttons and the transport controls are all supported. Oh, there you go, you've got one as well.
Yeah. I've got one. M key or something. X key. Yeah, X key.
Well, I've got one of these big sort of 61 key things that slides out.
Yeah, I love that.
I've got one that size as well.
Yeah, it's super nice. And I also bought a standalone number pad because with composition, the number pad is very helpful for Chord Note 4 and just like having that.
Absolutely.
And, so
the effort notation. Yep. Yeah, there's just so many situations this comes up, and it's also true with video editing, which is the other thing I started doing more and more of. Started getting a bit more serious about the camera setup and editing. And whilst there is, of course, Final Cut Pro for the iPad, and whilst DaVinci Resolve, albeit an extremely cut down version of it, does run on the iPads, and there are others as well, you can lack integration with some of these editing consoles and so forth. The feature sets are naturally cut down. There are a number of annoyances in Final Cut Pro, which was the nonlinear editor that I was using, particularly on the iPad.
Final Cut Pro, it's great that's there, and I love that they're doing iPad-y things, but I also want a switch, let's be in tablet mode and let's be in desktop. I'm on external monitor mode, because it is very much an app designed to be handheld almost. Don't even have a Magic Keyboard hooked up, because we're not really optimized for that even.
There are even fewer keyboard shortcuts, which is something Apple tends to provide quite readily on the iPad.
Yeah, it's all about the jog wheel and having
which is a fantastic piece of interface if you are using your hands on the screen.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things I will miss, that fantastic jog wheel interface. It's funny because Logic on the Mac literally does have one of those simple mode versus advanced mode toggles, I think, for people coming from GarageBand. So it's not that they're not aware of this sort of platform disparity. It's just that I think the aims are different. And I don't think the aims are wrong. I think they are very much tailored towards the device and how they perceive its mode of use versus the desktop. And of course, a lot of the desktop's capability comes as much from momentum and legacy as it does from contemporary intention on Apple's part. But I just found that gradually I was tripping up on more and more things, and my list of adaptions and allowances and compromises was perhaps becoming larger relative to the examples of where I felt particularly empowered by the iPad's more accessible interface and the inherently focused nature of the way it runs apps and things like that. And it was almost by a set of almost coincidental events that led me down this path towards suddenly being confronted by the fact that I was maybe adhering too much to some principle of focus and modularity with the iPad, and of maybe minimalism and simplicity, and I was paying too heavy a cost given how my needs for my main computer had changed.
Yeah. And with Final Cut, the fact that it can't resize the window just infuriates me to no end.
It's so strange.
It was released in a post-Stage Manager world. That's the thing. It was it came out well after that was in existence. It's just baffling, because
I think that probably with Final Cut, the example you and I are cruising directly towards, of course, with exporting the problem with Final Cut.
And LumaFusion,
and the window.
Yeah, and LumaFusion does it better. Third-party developers.
LumaFusion does, although of course you sacrifice a lot of interface niceties with LumaFusion. It's extremely flexible and customizable. It's got presets. Oh my goodness, what a thing to have! Final Cut, by the way, presets for things. But I think Apple is obviously making these decisions. I'm sure they're making them deliberately. I'm sure they're making them based on data. I don't for a moment think it is shoddiness or inconsideration. I think it is probably that Apple thing where they want to ensure an absolute minimum guaranteed level of performance and capability, even if it means imposing limitations on those who would maybe accept certain other compromises in order to do something with maybe a bit more performance or a bit more extensibility or something. It's like the multitasking thing all over again. The reason that it took so long to get multitasking, perhaps until the hardware had reached the point where they could guarantee an absolute bare minimum level of performance, because they're selling the entire experience to you. And not just a feature set, it's the entire end-to-end experience of using the thing and what emotions you associate with using the thing. And I think they're a lot more focused on that. But as you say, third-party manufacturers do have music production environments and video editing environments, which manage to do these things. You can plug in an iPad and I think use DaVinci Resolve, the cut down version, expanded on an external monitor. You certainly can with Apple's own Logic Pro on the iPad with a longer timeline and so on. But Final Cut, it just seems designed for the screen sizes that are available in iPads, and that's it. And
it's like they expect you to also have a Mac and to export your thing after you're done from your shoot. But it'd be so cool if they did. Yeah, it'd be so cool if they did like full external monitors where the iPad could be your viewer, and then you just have your timeline on the big external monitor. Like they could do cool things with two screens even. But they just choose not to. And the whole exporting thing, they added APIs well over a year ago, maybe 2 years ago, to allow extra RAM on the bigger iPads to do these background exports, and LumaFusion does this. You can leave a LumaFusion export. It doesn't cancel it out right away. You have a fair bit of time, and it'll keep running. But Final Cut, they just don't do any of that. It's ridiculous.
Yeah, like as soon as you touch anything else that causes Final Cut to resign its frontmost position, export failed.
Yeah. You accidentally jumped to the wrong stage editor stage. Oh no.
It's horrendous. We've all had that moment where, oh god, I can't believe you've just deliberately failed the export after an hour or whatever. Because the thing is, these machines are particularly plugged into Thunderbolt. You can readily edit massive video files, 4K 60, absolutely no problem, off of an external drive. You're not even being constrained by the internal storage, and the performance is such that you can absolutely do that. So you will often be exporting videos that will take an hour or something, but then you get a notification and you have the temerity to click it and the export fails. Ugh.
Yeah. And it doesn't even pause it. Like, that would be an even better experience if it can't do it for a reason. Let's pause the current export, and when we go back to the app, you can hit resume or whatever. But it just fails. You're like 50 minutes into it, just start from scratch, please.
No, it's an exercise for the profanity muscles every time that happens.
Yes. So, with that said, are there some favorite iPad apps that you're going to miss being on the Mac? Like what? Yeah.
The situation we find ourselves in is that you can run so many iPad apps on the Mac directly if you wish to, and there are counterparts to so many of the apps that I used. So I think there won't be many apps that I have to miss from the iPad in terms of an accompanying feature set or even a workflow. I think the thing I'll miss from the iPad is probably slightly more abstract than that. It is just that sense of the delightfulness of the experience, the recentness of design of the experience, that intentionality, that sort of touch-focused, personally interactive sort of feeling that the iPad drew this line after which people were allowed to say, we've been doing it this way for so long, let's sort of stop and go back to first principles and reconsider how this could work, how we could make this more accessible and more intuitive and more interactive and more delightful in the contemporary age of computing, rather than just continuing on with this inertia the way computing has always been. And we've seen so many innovations in interface design and responsiveness, and I think that's been because people have been given this implicit permission to reconsider how devices should work, and we should always be thankful, I think, to Apple for that as a minimum. And I think it is that sense of excitement and of this sort of renaissance of user interaction, I think, design, that I will perhaps have occasion to miss the most.
Yeah. As far as so rethinking of old paradigms, the trackpad and pointers, something I really love about iPad OS is they actually did rethink it for iPad OS, and developers can take advantage of it. So Ferrate's the best example, where you hold down Option and it changes the whole the ball into a big selection cursor. And so developers can really do a lot with the cursor if they choose to. And that's something pretty cool. But not every app does that. And the apps that choose to just ignore it, you might as well just have the Mac way of doing the cursor. Do you have feelings one way or the other, like the Mac style versus iPad and developers being able to do stuff with it?
I have enjoyed those features. I think the most recent iterations of iPads with respect to Apple Pencil support are another example, with the hover and the contextual menus and the shadow casting and all that stuff, some of which is useful, some of which is fun, some of which is both. There are always limitations. I noticed, for example, that with that feature you're talking about, whereby the cursor snaps to and conforms to the shape of interface elements, it's over. I don't know what they call it, adapts to interface or something. And there are apps where you have maybe a toolbar button that's a combined button when clicked, or a contextual menu when perhaps clicked on the right-hand side. Notably the Affinity suite, which I love very much. If you've got that animated cursor thing on, it becomes impossible to disclose the contextual menu because it always snaps to the button portion of it. So you sometimes have to kind of manage that by turning it on and off, which is an example of it's great when it's in first-party apps, but if it's an incomplete adoption of it, it can become a frustration. But it is again nice to see that Apple, I suppose, are still thinking about how to do these basic things. I've got to admit that I did turn that particular feature off. I find it a little bit distracting when the cursor feels like it's almost always under my control, but sometimes it just races towards something, like when you're walking the dog and suddenly the lead gets pulled out of your hand. It has that similar feeling of it's kind of momentary imbalance. So I personally didn't like it, but I acknowledge that it is a lovely feature.
Yeah. With the Mac, have you tried Sidecar with your iPad Pro yet?
I think I tried it experimentally back when it was introduced, and certainly the iPad Pro M4 screen is unmatched in terms of its beauty. But I didn't want to have a situation where I developed a sort of a multiple dependency kind of thing. I'd rather, the platforms are so large and their software ecosystems are so complex. I'd rather just have one thing. I mean, says the man who recently switched entire platforms once again. But I'd rather just have one thing on the go. And I think the iPad will move to take on, as I said, like a completely different, not ancillary or not reduced, but perhaps more, for me, leisure-focused role. And perhaps as an occasional writing tool as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, something I discovered when I got an Apple Pencil with Hover is with Sidecar, you can now fully use the mouse with the Apple Pencil because of Hover, which is just something that I don't think many people talk about. That's actually a thing where you can use your mouse and hover to move the mouse and then click it on the screen to click the mouse. And it's a really delightful way to use the Mac if you want to have a more tablet-y experience with that, which is kind of neat.
I'm one of these weird people who actually tries never to use the pointing device, though, be it the magic trackpad I have here or mice or whatever. I've even got my mechanical keyboard tricked out to do mouse movement and mouse button clicking for the odd occasion where I can't trigger something with the keyboard. And those are rare occasions, particularly on the Mac, where there's so many systems for manipulating the interface and navigating without touching the pointing device.
So in the past, you were pretty big in the Apple Pencil, and I was reading your article over the years, you kind of switched over your usage to a different device entirely, the Supernote e-ink tablets. And this is the first I've heard of these things. They look pretty cool. They're almost iPad price, so they're not inexpensive. They're kind of a premium e-ink tablet. They have their own ecosystem of different things they plug into. Can you share a bit on how you're using these things?
Yeah, e-ink tablets are a niche thing, and there are market forces at play. The manufacture of the actual panels, which are then sold to the various makers of e-ink devices, is a monopoly, and there's a limited supply. So that, of course, along with the niche market, drives the price up. So the price might be surprising or shocking if you first discover this particular market. But
now imagine Amazon has their own supply chain separate from that, right?
They still have to buy from
that one place. Oh, okay.
E-Ink company.
Oh,
Amazon's
wow.
in the
Okay,
position
so
whereby
E-Ink
they
is
can-
like a proprietary only. There's no like LCD world. You have many makers of LCDs, but with E-Ink, it's from one guy. That's interesting.
It is, although
Yeah.
I think we're at the point where whatever the legal protections are about to expire, such that I think the market's going to balloon in the next several years. But at the moment, that's still the case. Amazon, of course, with scale, can command preferential obtaining of supplies of those panels for its Kindle line and so on. So often Amazon will have a new generation of screen first, and then the other manufacturers will get them. But yes, I've developed an enormous love for these e-ink tablet devices and the feeling of writing on something that is not that slippery glass screen of an iPad, and the lack of backlighting and the extremely high resolution. It's always these days 300 dpi on their screens, and just the tactility of it and the feeling of a lovely sort of digital analog, if you'll allow that, of paper, and a separate writing surface from the thing that I'm looking at, something away from the computer. I just personally find it really conducive to focus and to thought. And of course, critically, it's also another fancy gadget to buy.
Yes. The writing experience. I have a love for fountain pens and real paper and all that. I don't get to use them as often as I'd like because I have no reason to. But when I do, it's delightful. How close is it to paper versus the iPad? Like, how grippy is it? How tactile is all that?
There's more than a single spectrum for these things, I think. As you'll know yourself, it's a very different feeling writing with an HB pencil and paper versus a gel ink ballpoint pen versus a fountain pen. They all have different characteristics, and indeed the different e-ink tablet manufacturers do use different film surfaces on top of the actual screen itself to give slightly different experiences. But in all cases, it's much, much, much closer to the paper end of the spectrum than an iPad. You do, of course, get things like the rock paper something. It's a screen that goes onto the iPad Pro magnetically even, and a corresponding replacement nib for the Apple Pencil, which gives a much more frictional sort of surface. And of course you get things like the paper-like trademark protector that goes on that tries to create a more frictional surface with the regular Apple Pencil tip. But these Supernote devices and e-ink devices in general have a feeling much closer to paper. I think the Remarkables are a lot more like a pencil subjectively. The Supernotes, which are the ones that I use, are probably a fair bit closer to your fountain pen experience. And Books, that's Boox, the company, that's a manufacturer of many of those things, is maybe a bit closer to the gel ink pen feeling.
Interesting. And you're able to say that, does that imply you have all these different brands as well?
Well, it's one of these deep rabbit holes you go into. I do have a cupboard of boxes and a wee spreadsheet of stuff I really ought to sell. So,
Yeah.
you know what it's like in technology. It's,
Oh, yes.
At least it's not class A narcotics instead.
Exactly. Refresh rate on e-ink in writing, that seems like, how does that jive? Because, like, is the refresh rate fast enough to keep up with?
Yes.
Yeah.
The refresh rate when you're flipping pages and so on is much more in keeping with the extremely comparatively slow refresh rate you would see with Kindles and so on. But writing is a special case. The digitizers are always set up such that it is much closer to what you would see with an Apple Pencil. I'm sure that it's not what is even the latency. It's single digits milliseconds. Yeah, for an Apple Pencil, it's not quite that low, but it is very, very responsive, and the ink trail does follow your hand. Short of doing an extremely rapid, large diagonal stroke, you won't notice lag behind at all.
That's
There is,
super
of course,
curious, yeah. Because, like, I guess
it's
refreshing an
interesting,
entire page is harder for e-ink versus just this little
It's
section.
because the recent versions of the e-ink display technology, I think, have gained the ability to do these more localized sort of subset refreshes, which is what's used for the pencils. Whereas when you are flicking pages or going to a different app or interface on the device, it does tend to refresh most of the display. So you do get that sort of black to white flash effect. I can tell you very quickly, as if you're a reader on a Kindle, you just stop noticing it. But the handwriting experience is completely different to what you would expect if I was to tell you it's a Kindle type thing you can write on. It's much closer to an Apple Pencil, and critically, it just feels so much nicer to the hand.
That's fascinating. Pressure sensitivity, does that exist at all in e-ink?
It does, yes. Virtually all of the e-ink devices use the Wacom electromagnetic resonance technology, licensed from that company, of course, which gives you the pressure sensitivity. The way it works is essentially that the screen surface itself, there's the e-ink, and then there's a sort of digitizer layer licensed from Wacom over it, which generates a field, and that field, it just sort of energizes a coil in the tip of the pen. The pen has no power source. It doesn't need to be paired to anything. It doesn't need to be charged or connected to anything at all.
Just wild.
Another nice effect. It's interesting, yeah, but it's like when you buy a Wacom tablet, you don't have to plug in the pen or give it batteries.
Okay,
or
yeah, I guess I
charge
forgot about
anything.
that, yeah.
It's the same technology, and it's also nice because it makes all of the pens or the styluses interchangeable between all the manufacturers' devices. You can happily use a Kindle Scribe pen on a Supernote and so forth. The one thing you need to look out for is that some of them, Supernotes in particular, have got a ceramic tip, which is obviously a material with an extremely high hardness, and if your device doesn't have a screen surface that's capable of taking that, you could cause
Scratch.
some physical damage if you press hard, yes. But other than that, it's the standard Wacom EMR, which includes thousands of levels of pressure sensitivity, and I think sometimes tilt sensitivity depending on the tool or the platform.
Very cool. And then does Supernote run its own custom OS? And like, are there apps or like I saw emails available? Like, how's that all? What's the experience of actually using the device?
It runs the Supernotes run a operating system called Chauvet, I presume named for that cave in the south of France where some of the best preserved cave paintings have been found. It's a fork of Android that's cut down. It's like an earlier version of Android, like 11, 12, something like that. And it's cut down, as I say, and it's tailored for e-ink in terms of how it presents its interface and what's available on it and so on. So you can, to a certain degree, sideload apps, even, APKs in Android, isn't it? The app packages. They will work to a greater or lesser degree. Typically, the pen responsiveness is the critical issue because they need to implement a very specific API supported by the device in order to have the responsiveness. And some apps do that. Microsoft OneNote, for example, certainly does, but you'll find other drawing apps that are popular, like Concepts or whatever, that have extreme lag because they haven't implemented that API. But the Kindle app, just the one that Android provides as an APK, is immediately side-loadable just via the standard interface on a Supernote, and you can pull across whatever it is that you like to use on Android. There are popular e-ink focused web browsers like e-ink Bro, and your Microsoft apps, and people have side-loaded the Play Store and all of that as well.
So you can install apps from the Play Store if you sideload that. And the sideload, you'd need a Mac or an iPad even to get the SD card, I'd imagine, just pops in. Yeah,
and I think you need to install, if you're installing the Play Store, there's something you need to install it via, not an Android developer, maybe the ADB Android debugging interface or something like that. And of course, if you're on a Mac, in order to get an Android device to mount at all, you need that special little thing that mounts the file system in a certain way. But it's free from Google, and you can find it readily enough. And of course, there are endless tutorials on YouTube and Reddit on how to do it. And the first time's annoying, the second time's fast, just like all things in tech. But you can do it if you want to. But of course, the purpose of these devices is more to get you away from all of the apps and the distractions rather than to give you another place to put them.
So is there like a home button? Like how does the actual OS, like, how do you navigate through that?
Supernote's rather different from even the competitors in its own market in that it doesn't really have a home screen. You're always in something.
Okay.
At most, you're in the file browser, either going to open a document in the reader or a note in the sort of note-taking app. Of course, there are task managing and calendar apps as well, but basically you're always in a document, and the device has sidebars, which are touch sensitive, not in the software interface, on the physical bezel of the device. And depending on which way you run your finger, it'll drop down what you might think of as a sort of iPad or Mac control center looking kind of interface that lets you jump off to other apps, quote unquote, or recent documents or such. But the thinking is very much that you're on the device to do something rather than to stare at a launcher or keep bouncing back to a launcher. So it's very much document first, and then the OS is something that's in the background and transient and temporary.
Interesting. Yeah. The iPad is definitely app first, to the chagrin of many people that came from the Mac. It's like, I'm trying to open this Word document. Why is it? Yeah, it's all app first. And that's shifted a little bit over the years with the Files app and stuff. A tad. As far as what you're actually using it, what's your like Note app of choice there? Does it sync to be available on other platforms, or is the purpose of your note taking here just to have as reference on your desk versus on your computer?
I do largely use it as reference on my desk. It does sync to Supernote's cloud, and you can choose where that is if you don't want your data in China, say, for example, or I suppose with respect in the United States these days, you can sync to the various third-party storage services, Box and whatever the Microsoft one is, whose name escapes me at the moment. Or is that Box, and Dropbox is one, and so on. You can access your notes via the Supernote Partner app on iPhone, iPad, Mac, I presume Windows as well, I assume Android, of course, as well. You can flip through them in that way. You can export them in various formats. The Supernote connects to any device on the same Wi-Fi via one of these. It gives you a URL to load up that's an IP address, and you can do live screen sharing of it. And the pen does provide an Apple Pencil hover-like cursor as you move around. If you're demonstrating something or collaborating on a document, you can of course share files back and forth. So there's a lot of options if you want to interoperate with other platforms that you're on or get your notes on and off. But I do try to use it largely as the way you would use a paper notebook.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. And then they also have public roadmap, which I find just super cool. That they have software updates, and they're, I guess, pretty frequent. Has that been the experience where you're getting updates pretty often? And is there anything you're looking forward to in the roadmap?
All of the e-ink tablet manufacturers are generally really good about having software updates of significance and impact every few months. There was, of course, a gap recently for the Chinese Lunar New Year where everyone finally got to have a holiday. Many of these manufacturers are in mainland China. But as you say, there's a Trello, there's a full software board for their roadmap and the things they have implemented and how things are grouped and whether something's blocked and all that stuff that will be very familiar to people working in teams of software developers. So you do have a lot of visibility into the plans of the company, and they are very active and interactive, particularly on Reddit. And that's the place that a lot of these companies tend to speak to their customers. So you do sort of know what's coming down. Really the only things I'm looking forward to would be perhaps there's a task list app on the Supernote, and at the moment it's closed up inside Supernote's own platform. I'd love it if that was to sync, or at least have an API, so that I can get those tasks via some mechanism into reminders on the Apple platforms. Their calendar does sync with Google Calendar, which of course you can then pull into iCloud Calendar that way. But I think anything that lets me do more of my sort of organizational tasks purely on the Supernote, but safe in the knowledge that I'm going to get the necessary reminders and summaries and so on my phone, that's what I'd be looking for. I don't find that there are any sort of banner features for the note-taking experience that are completely lacking, or they do at least have a plan for it. Generally, it's quite a mature platform now, having been going for a number of years, and as I say, they do update it regularly.
Yeah. So something I'm curious about is, I always admired your clean desk setup, right? And I'm curious if you ever contemplated getting a very sleek looking little iMac to sit there, and then maybe a laptop to go with it, or was a single device kind of paramount in how you use computers?
Well, I've had big iMacs in the past, way back in the Intel era, and indeed iMacs before that. I think I had the Bondi Blue and all that. So I thought about it. These days, to me, the Mac Minis are way more attractive.
They're very cute.
Of course, the Mac Studio as well, and even the Mac Mini, the cuteness, as you say, and the tiny footprint really belie the ridiculous power of these machines. These days, it's astonishing. But I felt that, all in all, given that I do have occasional need to go somewhere else, if I was switching to the Mac platform and making that commitment, then given that my needs are not absolutely outrageous, 10 streams of 8K video and whatever else, and, spinning up an LLM locally, then I thought a laptop is going to be more than enough for me, but I will go for the MacBook Pro, because it has been a very, very long time since I bought a MacBook Pro, and the space black is just so damn pretty.
Yes. Yeah, because I can see you going like the Mac Mini with a MacBook Air route, or spend that same amount of money for the MacBook Pro, which, that's one way to do it, right? Yeah.
Well, we've got, what I'm speaking to you on just now is an M2 MacBook Air in that very dark blue, what do they call it, midnight?
Oh yeah, midnight. Right? Yes.
Yeah, which seems
if you commit a crime,
engineered by.
Right there.
Oh, I know. It's clearly forensic scientists that created the coating, because they were so sick and tired of not being able to pull a good print off something.
Exactly. Yes.
But it's an extraordinarily powerful machine. It's absolutely fantastic, and it was our emergency. That's a comical term. It's our sort of household Mac of occasional recourse that we kept around. We basically both decided to get rid of the old respective MacBook Pros that we had and sync both of our accounts onto one new then machine, just to keep in the cupboard, because sometimes there's some website or whatever that you need to. So we did that. But I thought, I do not want to buy a new Mac every 12 months or even every 24 months. So I am going to get a silly MacBook Pro and keep it for 5 years plus or whatever.
So what configuration did you end up ordering? Was nano texture a temptation?
I looked at nano texture. I looked at a lot of videos, and I was in the Apple store yesterday with my son, funnily enough. Not to buy anything, it just happens to be on the way back from the Lego shop here, where we certainly did buy things. I was dreaming about Lego last night. Sorry, I think I spent 4 hours building yesterday. But I was in and I looked at it side by side, and their lighting is very favourable for the machines, of course. But I personally, it's not something that appeals to me more than the standard glossy screen. It's wonderful. It's extremely impressive. I could certainly absolutely understand why a person would choose that coating. Nothing against it at all. Nor do I have anything against the iPad at all. But that wasn't for me. Also, I do have to say that Apple's internal storage upgrade prices are madness. Absolute
They are,
madness.
yeah.
It's bordering upon theft. I mean, it's not just bordering upon, particularly when you've got Thunderbolt and the sheer speed of Thunderbolt hubs and docks and external NVMe enclosures, which I use here for offloading video files. So I didn't go beyond 2 terabytes for the internal storage, but everything else I just pressed all the buttons. So it's a M4 Max. What is the top one? 16 CPU and 40 GPU with 128 gigabytes of RAM.
Oh, wow. So you got plenty of RAM to wow. Yeah.
It's just stupid, isn't it? But it's it did depart Shanghai a couple of days ago. It's I think it's meant to arrive on Thursday. So the dog will be up at the window waiting for my wife to come home from work, and I'll be up at the window beside him, also with my tongue hanging out, waiting for that brown truck to drive down the street.
Yeah. And the big one or the small one?
The 16-inch, the big one.
Okay, nice.
Just because, again, it's largely going to be a ornament on the desk here, so I thought, hell, why shouldn't I just get the big, ridiculous one? And
big screens are nice. Eyes are... As we'll talk about, the Mac interface is very tiny.
Especially with my spectacles prescription these days.
So not too long ago, the M4 iPad Pro came out. The timing of this, as you talked about, there's nothing to do with like the iPad getting old or whatever, because this is a pretty new iPad you have there. External monitors kind of entered your life, and you got envious of the Mac experience with that. Is that kind of where this all started?
Pretty much, yeah. My wife and I both have offices here in the house. I'm obviously a writer. I work from home all the time, and my wife previously worked from home a good couple of days a week. The industry has, of course, shifted back to office, particularly this year. But for most of that time, we both needed offices at home, and she's got a work Intel MacBook Pro, one of the ones with touch bar even. I'm sure she'll be upgrading that soon, but it was a 16-inch, and she just, with the nature of her work, needed larger screens, so she got a beautiful big 27-inch Dell, which is USB-C. God, I love USB-C and Thunderbolt. So nice. The cross-compatibility, it's magnificent. It's just so different from the old days. You know, when we got to that stage... Sorry, carry on.
It's funny, though, with USB-C. My wife has a Dell work computer that's USB-C, but often she'll forget to bring the high enough power output adapter because it's USB-C. Everything should work, and the MacBook Air could charge off this little tiny thing, but the Dell, you need to bring the big honker of the charger. Yeah,
I suspect that if I am taxing the GPUs on the MacBook Pro M4, I'll probably have to plug in rather than drawing power from the Thunderbolt hub.
Well, the hubs provide a decent amount of power depending on what you have. I think they're like up there at the 60 watt. I don't know, depending on what hub you have, I guess.
I think I've got 65 watts at the moment. I've got the Thunderbolt 4 version of the CalDigit Element, but they've just released, they have released, but then promptly sold out of, quite rightly, the Element 5 version, which I'm desperate to get. I was pestering their UK salespeople on Friday. They're meant to get stock at the end of this month. They've, I think, upped it to 120 watts, and the port configurations are better. There's more USB-C and Thunderbolt 5 and fewer USB-A, and the power supply is physically smaller as well, so I'm desperate to get that. It's a lovely little dock. It's one of the best Thunderbolt things I've ever had. But yeah, we got to that stage where the battery tech improved so much that I sort of felt, oh wow, we finally solved that problem. And USB-C and Thunderbolt is the analog of that with respect to connecting stuff together and getting power to stuff. And there's just this feeling of finally they fixed it, because I've got the hub that's plugged into mains power and everything else just comes off it. This MacBook's being powered by the hub. My mechanical keyboard's being powered by it. My monitor was receiving a video signal and being powered, and the speakers that I use are just USB audio plugged into the monitor's USB port, which of course just participates via the whole USB bus. It's fantastic. It's just the dream of the future that we had far in the past has finally arrived.
Yeah, and a webcam is a part of the... Is that an external webcam as well, or...?
I would say that external webcam does it a disservice. It's one of these APS-C Sony Alphas. I've got the ZV-E10 Mark II that came out a few
that's why
months
you look
ago.
so good. Yeah.
It's certainly not genetics. I've got a 16mm f1.4 Sigma lens on it, and I'm using these little magnetically attached lav mics. I've got the thing in a cage. I don't know if you're a camera guy. I'm barely a camera guy, but I've upgraded that equipment substantially. And of course, even on the iPad these days, because of it supporting USB-C video, you can use it as a FaceTime camera, or even in Zoom and a couple of the other, I think, video conf apps. I think Skype might support it. But the Mac, of course, supporting everything, happily lets me use it. And that's a big advantage, because the FaceTime front-facing cameras on Macs, at least historically, have not been particularly fantastic when you're used to iOS.
Yeah. The Thunderbolt thing is so nice. Like, I remember back when the Thunderbolt monitor came out in like 2011, 2012, I ended up getting one of those for my MacBook Air 11-inch, and it felt like the future. But it was two things coming off the monitor back then. It was a MagSafe thing for power, and then the Thunderbolt, and then the monitor had a fair bit of ports on it. That's all I needed to plug in. It was lovely. And the move of the Thunderbolt docks has really been just mind-blowing for me. Like, so I've got the Thunderbolt dock. It's underneath, by all my stuff here. But I can plug my headless MacBook Air into it, which I got from the Vision Pro. Or I can plug my iPad into it, or even I discovered my PS5 Pro can plug into the Thunderbolt dock. And I was experimenting with that because the PS5 Pro removed the USB-A port in the front and replaced it with USB-C, which, of course, Sony gives you a USB-A dongle for their headphones. And it's just like, okay, I'm out of ports. Let's try this Thunderbolt hub, and it worked. And and that also brings the benefit of I can use these Pulse Elite headphones with my iPad or my Mac if I'm plugged into the hub. And it's rather brilliant to just have this hub just work everywhere,
Living the dream. No, it's fantastic technology. I got that CalDigit Element 4 thing a good old while ago, and for the first few days, I'm periodically putting my hand on top of it, checking to see that it's not 100 degrees or something. But it's magnificent technology.
Yeah, Ethernet's so there convenient for me too. It's lovely. Yeah.
Yeah, you get fancy docks that have got. You've got 10 gigabit Ethernet even, and of course all the SD and micro SD and headphones and so on. And it genuinely does just work. I resisted Thunderbolt docks for so long because they are comparatively very expensive compared to the USB dongle adapter things.
And USB docks, I did not. Well, USB docks, I tried and had terrible experiences with. I know it's buggy as all hell, and
I know.
Yeah.
And things drop off and things don't get enough power and all that. But Thunderbolt docks, I mean, if someone is watching or listening and is on the fence about it, it's a get what you pay for situation.
They're expensive for a reason.
Oh, yeah. But for the pain that they get rid of, they're fabulous.
And they seemingly last forever. I don't know. There's Thunderbolt 5, but I mean, 4 is plenty good for my, I don't know. Is there a reason
4 is 40 gigabits per second. I think that 5 goes up to, I think it at least doubles that, but in some circumstances it goes up past 120. I mean, who needs it? But
no, right?
If you can have it,
why not? Yeah. So you tried out the iPad with the external monitor. Did you run into the 4-window limit? What things on iPad with external monitor were this isn't quite right?
Yeah, I didn't run into the 4-window limit. I don't tend to have that much stuff open before I switch back to the Mac. I find naturally I'm doing it a bit more now I'm on the Mac, but no, I didn't tend to. I hadn't even remembered about the 4-window limit before you and I were talking before this show about that. But no, the thing with the iPad is that it sort of implicitly assumes the iPad screen itself is always what the macOS calls the main screen, the sort of primary screen. So if you're not careful about where your pointer is or which window is focused, you constantly have things spawning on a screen other than that that you perhaps wanted if you got a multi-screen setup. And Stage Manager, for all that it gives, and for all that it is wonderfully useful for, on the iPad, it is really problematic with respect to the focus, i.e. where your keystrokes and interactions are going to, and it really often gets out of sync with which app is visually frontmost versus where your keys are going to, what your keyboard shortcuts are affecting. And it just inevitably happens tens or dozens of times every single day, which starts to wear you down a bit, particularly if you're someone who tries to use the keyboard as close to 100% of the time as you can get away with.
Interesting. Yeah. They really do need to work on that. Like, that's definitely a thing, a problematic thing. Something I was experiencing with Vision OS.
Technologies came about in different orders on the Mac versus the iPad, so
yeah,
I sympathize.
Something I was experiencing with Vision OS the other day, I didn't realize this is how it works, but I was playing with my PS5 through Portal, and I looked at a different window for reference, and the controller, I could scroll like the window of that window with the controller as the joystick. It's like, that's interesting. I'm not sure if I like that, because I'd like to be able to glance at whatever that walkthrough while I'm also controlling the game. But it's kind of interesting, the whole like where focus lies, and on Vision OS, the keyboard thankfully I think doesn't do that. It'll keep typing and stuff, but I don't know where I'm going with that. But the whole where focus lies. Apple has very opinionated opinions on that stuff, and
obviously, I mean, they designed iOS from the point of view of touch, and then the keyboard, of course, was kind of there from the start, but it was maybe initially mostly the software keyboard. Then we got hardware keyboard support. Then we got pointer support a decent bit later in its contemporary form. And then on the side of that, you've got the various accessibility types of focus. And I use a couple of those for convenience reasons. And I think it just all gets a bit out of sync and gets a bit confused. And I would routinely have the situation where I would flick away from Ulysses Command Tab out to another app to do something, and then Command Tab back, and it would be visually frontmost, and the multitasking 3-dot widget at the top center of the frontmost window would be darkened to indicate that it was frontmost, and the app switcher would indeed indicate it was frontmost, but the typing wasn't going to Ulysses, and the keyboard shortcuts were maybe going out to whatever I'd been in previously, and you need to switch there and switch back, or physically click in, which for me is like the ultimate sacrifice of dignity, having to take my hand or pointing device like a caveman. And so it's such a tiny thing to complain about, but when it happens 2 or 3 times every hour your whole day, it's wearing.
It adds up, yeah. So let's get to some experiences as far as like the iPad versus the Mac. So the iPad, being the joyful, fun, animating device, is much slower but more delightful. How do you? What are your thoughts with like speed versus fun?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to be using the language of emotion to minimize the iPad at all. I think what the iPad and iOS do is fantastic in terms of accessibility in the broad sense for people, and about making devices feel like companions, and about making devices feel fluid. But performance it's not just about feedback. It's also about how quickly it performs the task you want, and often feedback is actually a delay to getting the thing done. Like the longer it takes because of animations and other niceties to say disclose a panel or pop up a keyboard if you're not using a physical one, or switching to an app, the more sugar on the interface, the more delight, the more fluidity and feedback in that sense of responsiveness that there is, the longer it takes you to get to the next thing that you're wanting to do and to sort of process the input.
It'd be as if the Mac, instead of launching an app immediately, you're brought back to the early 2000s where it bounces in the dock a couple times just so you can see the bounce,
Yeah. And it's like, it's cute, but the reason the bounce is there, frankly, is it's a loading screen. It's something to look at and make you not put your hand through the screen in frustration. And when the need for that goes away, then what you want is to get to the next thing and do the next task.
I wonder how many kids know it bounces because Macs are so fast these days.
I suspect a dwindling, vanishingly small number.
Yes.
And that's a victory in a way for the industry and for hardware design and so on. But when you're using devices not to demo to someone else and not, one of the people in the Apple ads wearing impossibly fashionable clothes and was trying to haircut and in the broad sunlight of California that we never get here, and you're just wanting to get the damn thing done, pardon me, all of these niceties, it's like, how many years has it been since I turned off the genie effect in the dock or stopped minimizing windows that way?
You don't hold down the shift key when you minimize your windows to just revel in that?
Maybe for old time's sake once in a while, but I sure as hell don't do it every single time I want to minimize a window. And the iPad kind of makes a lot of that stuff almost non-optional. So there's an awful lot of delightful micro waiting between things. And whilst that is because the device is incredibly sort of fluid and responsive in the sense of doing something with you as you're doing it, the kind of responsiveness you mostly, I think, want when you're trying to get something done is to get the thing done as quickly as possible.
Yeah. I think they removed the slowdown thing when you minimize and hold. I just tried it. It wasn't working for me, sadly.
I think there's a terminal command that you can use to re-enable it.
Oh,
if
good.
You so wish.
So I do love it's fun. I tried it. It's like, it's not there right now. It's sad. It's such a fun demo with just Jobs doing that. It's like, look at this, beautiful. Yeah. I wonder if video still plays if minimized in the dock. I'm surely it does. Anyways,
if this was an iPad, then trying to, not that it minimizes, but if you tried to minimize it, the call I think would probably end.
Yes, it would. Yes. Another thing you rightfully point out is the iPad just can't do certain things for whatever reasons. My example here is audio hijack. For years, I had to use the Zoom H6 recorder. And sadly, that recorder died after like 7 years. But for whatever reasons, Apple hasn't given the APIs to run that on iPadOS. Like, it seems silly. The APIs should be able to just like put them on iPadOS, but they're not there. What are some of the things that just aren't on iPadOS that seem silly they're not there?
Well, one person's silly is another person's understandable. I'm certain that the reason for the lack of those multi-stream audio APIs is, of course, that old Apple sensible thing of guaranteeing a certain minimum level of performance. And, of course, in many cases, they would make the security argument for the omission of a lot of these things. I think customizations of your experience and of the interface is probably the one that would spring to mind for most people. Changing how things work. If you want to find things but you don't want to use Spotlight on the iPad, you're not going to find things. Whereas there are any number of options on the Mac. If you want to go down and tweak things using a terminal, getting a local shell, admittedly that's fairly niche in the grand scale of things. Integrating with hardware, as we touched on previously. You need to really do a great deal of diligence when thinking about buying a peripheral or whatever to make sure you can actually use it in more than a basic way on the iPad. Mechanical keyboards, they are of course USB and or Bluetooth keyboards and they work just fine in that regard on iPad OS, but the whole point of these things is to customize them, to change the key map layout, and that invariably involves flashing firmware via USB, and you can't do that on the iPad. You need to get the relevant app on a Mac or, God forbid, a PC to do that briefly, and then plug the thing back into the the iPad. And granted, it's changing because Apple has given the abilities of shared device drivers for USB devices embedded inside iPad applications. So it's not a theoretical impossibility, but at the moment, so many things are practically not possible.
Yeah, I wonder who the first mechanical keyboard manufacturer will be to have their iPad app that can flash firmware. Because I think it could be done if they had the desire.
I believe so, given that you can have a USB device driver now. I mean, Stream, I think, what is it that makes the Stream Deck? Elgato. They've got an API whereby app makers can, embed their library when they're building their app, and then their app will support the Stream Deck. But one of these things that's lacking compared to macOS is, of course, that iPad OS will not inform an app when the frontmost app has changed, unless it's that app itself. And that's what things like Stream Decks and video editing consoles and so on use to know which key set or which set of functions to bring to the front, because it's based on the app that comes forward. And those APIs, which I think are largely related to accessibility, they're just prohibited on iOS and iPad OS for no doubt reasonable reasons of security, but it comes across to the end user as a limitation.
For sure. Another thing you mentioned in the article, and I just had a amen moment with it, was the file providers in the Files app. This was introduced forever ago with like the iPad Pro second generation, maybe around that era, maybe before that. And it's great when it works. Like, it honestly is. Like, the Synology apps, like, they integrate with this. I have a Synology, and they integrate with the Files app, and it's actually better than on the Mac as far as, like, let me access my Synology instead of, like, finding some server I need to mount and all that shenanigans. When it works, it's great, but often it doesn't work, and things just never upload, or you can't log into it properly, and it just is buggy as you get. I mean, like, this is something that could be great, but sometimes just isn't. What's the file provider you run up against with this?
Well, it's a source of particular frustration, I think, because files providers are one of the, counted on the fingers of one hand, most important ways that you can do some of the stuff from the desktop when you're on an iPad. It's this sort of cheaty way. iCloud Drive itself is a kind of a files provider that has first-class status on iPad OS. And the thing that I used it for, to answer your question, is for getting terminal access to remote servers via SSH, because there's a wonderful app on the iOS platforms called Secure Shellfish, and it is a terminal, of course, not a local terminal. It's a remote terminal with SSH keys and all that sort of stuff, but it also can vend your server bookmarks as file providers in the Files app, so you can securely mount a server as a sort of pseudo drive in Files, and critically in the apps which use the standard system open and save interface, which is obviously far more powerful because you can then use essentially any app as a remote file editor on the server. And I use it with Textastics, which is a wonderful text editing and coding app. It was the way that I coped with the extreme depression and bereavement of leaving behind BBEdit on macOS when I moved away, which I thankfully now have back in my dock at last. Yeah.
So on the Mac, I've been using it a bit more because I got this headless MacBook Air. I bought this. I'm not sure if I bought a $300 MacBook Air M1 on eBay. Had a broken screen, got rid of the screen, and now it's a great thing to plug into an external monitor. It's like a little, it's a computer in there, and works great with the Vision Pro is the reason I got it. But something you pointed out in your article is things haven't really changed that much. Like High Sierra was the last OS. You're probably the same way. Were you coming from High Sierra as your last experience with like Macs?
I would need to look it up. Whatever seems appropriate for late 2016, but I've rather lost track.
Right, yeah, but things haven't really changed. It's pretty much the same. The one thing I think we should talk about is it's just more annoying than it was a decade ago. Like, notifications are everywhere. You have to accept permissions for every little thing, and
it's like the rest of us, I mean, like, I'm 45 now, and in the time that has elapsed, macOS has become more anxious, just as I have about everything. It's constantly having these little mini panics that it needs to tell you about, not in the kernel sense, of course, but that, something bad might be happening, and you need to know that this has just happened. Ping, 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 ping.
Yeah, the team at Apple should watch the Leopard keynote where they make fun of Vista and all the notifications. They should rewatch that. Yes.
To be completely fair, in two senses, the surrounding environment of the world has changed an awful lot since then, and also I've been switching back to a platform, so I've been doing a whole load of installing apps and installing utilities, so I've kind of front loaded all these annoyances all together, and it has calmed down hugely, to be completely fair. It would be disingenuous to claim that it was perpetually at that level. That's not the case, but it was maybe a wee bit of a dampener on the welcome Mac experience. You get the big slick hello and all that, and then it tells you like 45 times, this is installed a login item, or you need to give this permission in accessibility settings, or something like that. But yeah, it's largely the same. It's just gotten an awful lot more additional options for ways to do the same thing in slightly different ways. Different ways to manage Windows, and there's Stage Manager, but then there's Mission Control, and there's Spaces, and there's Screens, and there's, it's like, how many of these things do I need? I kind of associated this with, if you'll pardon me, the Android approach of, if a competitor has it, then we have to have it as well, regardless of how many different options that gives you to deal with.
Yeah, Apple's approach is, if we introduce this, we can never take it away. Or it'll be very painful if we do. I think Dashboard finally got removed, stuff like that. But yeah, so you can use Spaces from the Leopard introduction. If you're still happy with Spaces, you can keep using Spaces. And now that Stage Manager's there, you can keep using Stage Manager, even though people don't seem to appreciate that one.
I've just been turning things off,
Launch Bar is still, or Launchpad is still there.
Yeah, I just
if you want the iPad
got
experience,
rid of that.
Yeah,
I know. I took it out of one. It looks silly to my mind. Apologies to those who love it. It's just my own personal opinion. It looks silly on a massive screen, that Launchpad thing. It reminds me of what was the thing that they had years and years ago in macOS, where it was an interface like a cinema, like red curtain screen and everything to watch media. Yeah,
I love Front Row. You get a little remote for your Mac
at the time, but all these icons popping up and Launchpad being the dock, I just got rid of that. The only time I accidentally launched it, funnily enough, was when I plugged in a PS4 DualShock and just discovered that when you hit the PS button, for some reason it pops up Launchpads by
because
default.
it's the whole it is Apple bringing the iPad to the Mac. It's the same. So on the iPad, you have the 5-finger gesture of pinching all your fingers in to go home. That exists on the Mac.
For the PS.
Yeah, if you do that on the Mac, you'll go to the Launchpad, the home. Which is,
I kind of got that. Yeah, I mean, it's the same. Like on the Switch, you hit the home button, it pops back out to the game chooser. So fair enough. But
but it's funny. It's like it's literally the home.
I even saw it because, I mean, good lord, of all the people who don't want to use Launchpad on a Mac, I have to be high on the list.
Oh gosh. So something you also mentioned in the pieces, and I noticed this right away, is everything's so small in Mac OS, which makes sense. You got a little mouse, and how often are you hitting Command Plus like I am to make sure you can necessarily read the text of the screen and all that?
Well, I mean, part of this is that the Mac is at pixel scale, the tip of the mouse scale, whereas iPad OS is at like tip of your finger scale, which is much larger. But yeah, I suddenly found, particularly I guess with the switch to a large screen, that everything was very tiny. I've enabled the slightly larger menu bar text, and I think I've got it on the penultimate resolution for that this big display supports, not the full HD, because it's just silly, But yeah, everything does seem very wee. Certainly in Ulysses, I bumped up the point size a little bit, and I find Notes, the Apple app of that name, its text is rather surprisingly small just to look at it. I'm sure part of that is just my decaying body. But yeah, generally everything I think is designed for the order of precision of the tip of a mouse pointer, which is at the pixel level versus within arm's reach, within the sort of box of an iPad you can look at, and the precision of a fingertip or so, which I completely understand. It's not a failing. It's just a difference that's inherent to the platform, which has been, I wouldn't even quite say jarring, but it's been very noticeable to me just because of this sudden contrast. But it's not a bad thing.
Yeah. On the Vision Pro, it can be very comical with the different resolutions you can choose, and you make it as tiny and like just unable to see anything is just like comically small. It's like the ability to do that's very neat, but I do bump it up a bit on the resolution side of things. It is funny, you can turn your Mac into whatever 800 by 600 mode if you want to relive the 90s, back when monitors were like
well,
that.
I was imagining that if I was going to do some gaming, I might well have to do that. But in fairness, the silly MacBook Pro I've got, I think I'll be starting at best settings for whatever game and seeing how it goes.
Yeah, and you have 2 terabytes, so you can actually install games. My 256 gigabyte MacBook Air, I tried to install a game, and it's like, you don't have 100 gigabytes free. Sorry.
It's gotten ridiculous, hasn't it?
Yeah, they're big these days, yeah. Thankfully, you can now install stuff on external drives from the Mac App Store, so I got to try that again and give Death Stranding a go on the Mac,
That's what the Thunderbolt is for.
Exactly, yeah. So something you mentioned in the piece, which I've said this before, but it seems like the iPad doesn't have a direction. Like the Vision Pro is Mike Rockwell. I feel confident he has a vision for that platform and the OS and everything. The iPad, I couldn't tell you who runs iPad. Like, who is the visionary behind where the OS is going? It seems directionless. They seem to just get a few things every couple years. Like, they just throw the iPad a bone versus having someone that's spearheading it. Is that kind of your feelings regarding it too? Like, the iPhone is the primary platform, the iPad's just along for the ride.
I think there is a fairness to that. I think that the iPad is difficult for Apple because I think I said in the piece actually that computers and phones came about in terms of what they could do, and that's intimately connected with the device itself, whereas tablets came about as a form factor of something that already existed without a separate clear use case in mind. And the original marketing with that sort of iPad coming in between at the keynote, if I'm recalling correctly, sort of was maybe a wee bit of a warning sign of that. I think that the world has very much decided that tablets are incredibly useful as an accessible, large screen, portable device that lets you do a whole bunch of the stuff you'd want to do on a computer in a more portable and friendly form, and certainly as a media device and all that kind of thing. But I don't think that the industry yet has a clear picture of what direction tablets should expand in. I think that computer companies with these long heritages of making desktop type computers are sort of, they're automatically biased towards moving things in the direction of what we would call functionality on a desktop computer. And that's the way we all conceptualize adding value. It's to do with this awful word productivity and words like power and feature set and all this kind of thing. And I'm just not convinced that that is the way the wind is blowing for these tablet devices. But the problem is, if you don't do that, then that whole segment has kind of pre-stagnated. There's only so many more ways. Okay, you can have novel display technologies, and you can have novel scanners and cameras, and you can make the screens foldable, and goodness knows what else. But in terms of expanding its appeal, which is presumably what the makers, including Apple, want to do, there just isn't a clear argument for what it is that is lacking on a tablet device, but which isn't a reason to go to a different type of device. And I think that's probably at the core of the problem. And I certainly don't claim to have an answer to it either. I just feel that that's one of the big bumps that I encountered myself, and finally it was enough to sort of jump the train over to this other track of saying, well, I might as well be on a computer where there may be less intentionality and less innovation in the classic sense, but there is absolutely no shortage of responsiveness and flexibility and of compatibility and so on. I think I just probably realised that I guess I'd done that really human thing of forgetting to periodically re-examine my needs and my beliefs and to make an intentional decision on that basis. I suppose there's an irony in that it was the iPads, what's surely one of the most intentional and willfully redesigned devices we've encountered, that kind of caused me to do that. I mean, certainly that's a more poetic vision than I could lay claim to for when I was writing the piece.
Sure.
But it is a difficult problem. I think the industry continues to grapple with it, and I think it's why you get these little false dichotomies about consuming versus creating and all this kind of thing. I think those are just the shrapnel of this ongoing struggle with a device that ultimately was created for its physical aspects rather than for a need that had been identified that it could uniquely suit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it seems like the updates that it is getting as of late have been Apple Pencil focused and using it more as a tablet versus, let's have the Magic Keyboard hooked up and be more productivity focused. It's more, let's use it as a tablet, let's use the drawing aspects of the pencil and the math notes and all that kind of cool stuff there.
I think the thing with the iPad is that Apple has almost sort of hamstrung themselves into having to constantly demonstrate and capitalize on the iPad's modularity and its shape-shifting nature, which is certainly a compelling aspect of the device.
Yeah.
But it doesn't in and of itself make an argument that it's a device you should be using more often in particular than any other one, because the fact that it came from the same genetics, I suppose, as iOS has, it's really put the writing on the wall for what it does, and all of the iPad's updates and enhancements towards productivity, terrible word, because you can be productive on a napkin with a pencil. It's productivity is a function of the person. But all of its advances towards comprehensiveness and functionality and so on have all firmly been towards computer, at which point eventually one has to sort of ask that question, so are you telling me to use the iPad or are you just telling me to use a computer?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I am super excited for when my daughter is of age to start learning math, because math notes I would have so much fun going through first grade math or whatever that is when they start doing math with math notes. I'm not sure if you're at all excited to start using math notes.
I used it a little bit recently because the tax year in the United Kingdom, including Scotland, it runs April to April, but the online filing deadline is at the end of January. So being a normal person, obviously I have a mad rush in the middle of January with a yearly recurring reminder that pops up rather than being sensible and doing a wee bit every month. That's how you could detect that someone was an alien in disguise, because they'd responsibly update their tax accounting at the end of each month.
No one does that.
But
yes.
I did have reason to, I think I had the spreadsheet open on this M2 MacBook Air, but the math notes popped into my mind just remembering it from the keynote, and I thought I'll give that a wee try, and it's remarkable. It does have that kind of spooky magic technology aspect.
Yeah, it does, yeah. Towards the end of the piece, it seemed like a rather sad sentiment, though. That you're on the Mac once again, but it's not delightful, not pretty, not aspirational or innovative, but it's usable. Do you have any hope 10 years from now, like a decade from now, will the iPad team finally get their stuff together so it's both delightful and usable?
Well, I mean, allow me a little bit of, writerly license with regard to the phrasing and the toning of that piece. What I didn't want to do was make it seem like I was saying, iPad crap, Mac fantastic, I'm back from out in the cold, screw you guys, because it's not the case. And it's not even just an oversimplification of the case. It just doesn't characterize the way I feel about it, or I think the reality of the platforms. What I was trying to say, however clumsily, was that there are absolutely things from iPad OS that I will have cause to miss each day, and that I hugely appreciate considerate design and innovative design, and indeed even delightfulness in design. And I keep coming back to this idea of the companionability of the device, and I don't think that has been bettered, in comparison to the iPad, and that those are things I notice the absence of, because whilst the Mac is desperately eager to do whatever you want it to do in whatever configuration with whatever you've connected to it, simply because of its long legacy of accretion rather than wholly directed design. And I think because of its, playing catch-up thing for that long period with Windows in terms of market share and the chip on the shoulder and the sort of black sheep of the computer family kind of thing that was going on. The Mac had it even worse and for longer in that regard than the iPad has with respect to consumption and creation and all of that, and being a serious machine. I mean, think about IBM and PCs and all that.
It was bad back then. It's like, you can't use a Mac. I can't open that file that I sent you because you don't have the right app. Or if you open up that on your Mac version of Word, it'll look all wonky. So you need to, all sorts of stuff like that.
And I think that I see in many ways, if the iPad were a child, figuratively speaking, of Mac OS, I could see Mac OS feeling a little sad that the son has to, bear some of the burdens of the father or the mother or whatever in that regard. That sort of finding of an identity, of improving one's worth. The Mac, it's magnificent, it's flexible, it is, for my money, certainly the most, in a full rounded overall considered sense, the most usable, not just in terms of the flexibility, the power, the availability of software and so on, but also the usability and interaction design, all of it together, of the desktop operating systems. I think that it is bettered by other things in different ways, and that's always going to be the case. Such is the nature of competition and innovation. It's not a failing, it's just the fact that everything is always in flux. And the iPad has so many strong points that I think the Mac can learn from. In terms of going the other way, I think that probably the things that iPad can learn from or acquire from the Mac would all take the iPad uncomfortably close to the Mac from a product differentiation standpoint. And we must, of course, remember that Apple is a business that is responsible to its shareholders and so on and so forth, and that positioning of different devices within the market is a key concern, even though as end users we see that as vaguely dirty and trivial and irrelevant to our needs. It's nevertheless a reality, and I do not envy those who have to create that roadmap for the iPad, because it's so interesting that whilst the Mac is the thing that's been around so long and has just gathered layers, or like the rings of a tree, And the iPad is the one that's been designed from scratch. It is the iPad whose recent advancements have all been borrowings from the Mac platform or desktop platforms instead, or ways to simulate or create workarounds in order to have those things. And I think that if I were at Apple considering things in that way, that I might be a little bit worried that the iPad needs a clear vision. And I do not say that to denigrate anyone who is involved and who is doing those incredibly difficult jobs. And I certainly don't say it to denigrate the iPad platform, which I continue to love and continue to be excited about, and which I will continue to keep an eye on.
Yeah. So you haven't sold your iPad Pro and don't plan on it. And I can attest these things last for many, many years. I have my M1 iPad Pro still up and running, works great. I have that as my big boy, and then I have the smaller M4. I'm not sure what will inspire me to upgrade to the M5 or M6 because I think I'll hang on to this smaller one for many years, and then eventually the big one will get updated. But yeah, so your M4 will last a long time. And you're trying to search for a role for it. And we talked about the signing of the ebooks. You use Ulysses, which is a subscription across both iPad and Mac. Do you see there being situations where you just want to focus in on writing and not like have the iPad be that focus tool when you're just sitting down the right?
Did you say choosing to use the iPad as the focus tool?
Yeah. When you're I just need to write. Ulysses syncs everywhere, so your data is there already, and
completely. I mean, in a way, this is just another version of using these e-ink notebook devices. There is. It is, of course, a substantial privilege to be able to be in the position to purchase a piece of hardware or anything in order to dedicate it to a single task. And it's not something that is done lightly or that is within everyone's reach. But if you can, there are definite benefits to it because things are designed for particular uses, except for computers that are designed for everything. And on that spectrum, the iPad's much closer to being something that's designed for a particular set of uses. Okay, it's chameleonic and it's modular and it can change shape, but writing and reading and these kind of pursuits that need a sort of singular focus and either a tactility or an exclusivity, I think sit very comfortably on the iPad. And there are a great many devices out there that are made just for writing. Indeed, historically, the precursors to computers were just such devices. And you do get these little, Free Write or something, that's a keyboard that's got a wee LCD or maybe even e-ink these days screen where you're just sitting and writing. The word processor machines back in the day, I had one before I ever had a computer. Amstrad Notepad, I think it was called, way back in the early 90s. And the iPad can absolutely be that in a moment. With Ulysses being virtually at feature parity on all of those platforms, everything syncing via iCloud, one of the most likely usage scenarios for me is absolutely to keep it as a wee writing pad if I'm going to the coffee shop or something and I don't want to take the insanity of the M4 Max 16-inch ludicrous thing, which I'm desperately looking forward to receiving. The iPad makes way more sense, and it's also something that I can more readily share with my son and show things to my son on and use as his bridge to whatever he might use in the future, because of course the landscape of personal computing for our children is unimaginable compared to what you and I have had. And I think now that you asked me that question and I'm sitting here thinking about it, perhaps that is the greatest reason of all, to keep a close eye on the iPad and sort of similar platforms, because I think that come what may, they are going to be much closer to the lingua franca for our children's personal device environment than the computers that we have.
Yeah, I can attest even 2-year-olds figure out how to use iPhones without any instruction. So iPads are a natural leap.
Yes.
It is wild how they dismiss notifications, swipe it up, and they find their way to different
skip
apps.
ads button as well.
Yeah.
My 4-year-old's very good at that.
Yeah.
And he's very good at unlocking the parental settings on YouTube Kids by solving the wee arithmetic problem that slides in. Getting very good at that. I think I do actually have on my reminders a to-do to properly set up parental controls, because it's on that shared family sort of buying plan thing on my credit card, and he is too bloody clever with clicking things he really should not.
The YouTube Kids app is it's a cool app. I'm glad, like, it's cool that's actually there. The YouTube Kids app, it has the whole arithmetic. It's like, I gotta do math to get out of this right now. Yeah. But anything else you'd like to share before we wrap it up?
Just to reiterate that it's not an abandoning. It's reintroduction to something that's very familiar, but that I absolutely love both platforms, and the iPad let me do all of my work for 8.5 years, and it can certainly do so for others as well. And the most important thing, I would say, which I preach often but of course forget to actually practice, is that decisions made based on sort of principle or aesthetics rather than practicality should regularly be re-examined, because people and needs change and there are always other options.
Absolutely. So with that said, where can people find your excellent books, most of them written on iPad at this point?
That's very true.
And read your very in-depth blog post about what we've been talking about.
Well, whether they are excellent or in-depth, respectively, or not, I appreciate the compliment, and they can all be found at my site. My name is Matt Gemmell, with 2 T's and 2 M's and 2 L's, so it's mattgemmell.scott, because you'll have noticed the accent, so that's mattgemmell.scott. The books are there, the articles and everything else.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Matt, for your time today. It's been great catching up and learning about this the switch over.
It's been an absolute delight as always, Tim. Thank you so much.
Well, that's my discussion with Matt. My thanks to Matt for his time recording. My thanks to you for your time and attention tuning in. Make sure to check out Matt's blog and his books over at mattgemmell.scot. And as a reminder, you can support this podcast over at patreon.com/iPadPros or by subscribing in Apple Podcasts. With that, I'll talk with everyone again real soon.